Hi, everyone. You're listening to Bug Talk, a podcast created by members of the entomology department at Michigan State University. I'm Natalie, and today, as our guest, we have the wonderful Dr. Kate Boersma. Kate, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm a professor at the University of San Diego in California. I am in my fifth year as a faculty member in the Department of Biology. Um, yeah, how deep do you want me to go, Natalie? You want me to go into
Um,
what I do for research or not yet?
yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what you do for research at USD?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a community ecologist. So that means that I'm interested in how communities of organisms, like multi-species communities, all function together and help maintain ecosystems, basically. And in my case, as an aquatic entomologist, which is how I got invited to Bug Talk, I assume, I'm looking at aquatic invertebrate communities as a way to understand how aquatic ecosystems function. And so specifically for me, I'm interested in desert aquatic organisms. As you can imagine, critters that live in ponds and streams and deserts really have to have amazing adaptations in order to be able to survive the environmental stresses that they undergo there. Our streams here, our rivers, they don't look like creeks up in Michigan. They dry sometimes for entire years at a time before the water returns until there's a wet year. We have some streams that dry for a couple months and then they get water again during the winter months. And then we have some perennial streams which flow year round. And so we have this big diversity of habitat types. And each of those, as you might imagine, can house different insect species. And so aquatic insects are a great tool for asking questions about the ecosystem because they're so responsive. And because if you're looking at a community of 50 different aquatic insect species, then some of them are going to respond to some factors, some are going to be able to withstand some stressors. And so if you look at that community of insects as a whole, it's a really powerful way to ask questions about how things change at the landscape level.
Yeah, so you definitely mentioned how different the environment you're working in San Diego and Southern California and the Southwest is from our Michigan, our like nice green. Right now it's snowing outside. How did you end up in desert aquatic ecology?
Accidentally. So I'm from Chicago, so I'm also a Midwest girl, and I moved west after I finished college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was not one of those students who knew since I was born that I wanted to be a professor. No, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I kind of liked science. So I got my undergrad degree in environmental science. I moved west, settled in Oregon, and ended up working a few jobs and then going to school. I actually got my undergrad degree in marine fisheries. And it was the end. No, my undergrad degree was in environmental science. My master's was in marine fisheries. And at the very end of my master's, I was really excited about ecology, but I didn't kind of get seasick. And so didn't really want to do marine stuff. And I just happened to go to a talk by a researcher named Deb Finn, Dr. Deb Finn, and she was talking about how in these desert streams, there are these patches in the summer that they separate and they look like little bathtubs, like little pools of water instead of like streams. And each of those pools has an entire community of invertebrates. And you can go by yourself walking in the woods with a net and like sample entire communities of organisms. And that's something you can't do if you're studying fish or wolves in Yellowstone or anything larger than maybe this big, right? It's so
Mhm.
powerful if you have questions about basic ecology to be able to go out and sample entire communities, especially at that level of change. Like every year, it'll homogenize when the stream channel connects. And then every summer, they'll separate to these bathtubs. And for those of you who've taken ecology, you remember successional trajectories, you remember disturbance ecology, all those cool concepts you can just see like right on the landscape. So I was nerdy about ecology before I was nerdy about deserts. And so I saw this talk And don't do this, people, but I signed up for a PhD program before I had been to the desert. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. Like, we didn't go camping or hiking when I was a kid. That wasn't a thing. And so I sort of came into my own as a field ecologist very gradually. And when I found stuff I liked, I just kept doing it. So I happened to fall into David Lytle's lab at Oregon State University for my PhD. And that first fall was when I went to the desert for the first time in my PhD.
Oh no.
So, okay, so I didn't have to commit. So I could have done any project with Dr. Lytle, right?
Mhm.
So Dave would let me do all different kinds of things. So if I didn't end up liking the desert, that would have been okay. But our program was at Oregon State University, but all our research was down in southern Arizona and northern Mexico, working in these amazing streams that fragment with these invertebrate communities. And so as soon as I went to the field, saw my first cactus, I fell in love. And I specifically have fallen in love with water in the desert and the organisms that can survive there. It's just so amazing. Evolutionarily, to be able to manage that kind of disturbance and recover, it's just really, really impressive. And so as I sampled, as I learned the aquatic invertebrate community, as I got better at my identification skills, I realized just how neat these animals are. Like, normal people don't know how many amazing invertebrates there are. And so once I discovered it, I was hooked. And then this job in San Diego came up, and it was serendipity, because I wanted to work in the desert anyway. And this ecologist job came up, and here I am.
Didn't you start at USD as like a postdoc though before you moved into your faculty, you're an associate professor
Yes,
position?
I'm an assistant professor, not
Assistant.
yet. So I go up
Okay.
for tenure in the fall.
Oh my gosh,
But
that's
yeah,
exciting.
I know it is exciting. It's a little, yeah, it's very exciting. Yes, my trajectory involves a lot of luck. So I just happened to end up in Portland, Oregon when a job came available. I just happened to go to Deb Finn's talk about desert streams, and I just happened to find a postdoc at the University of San Diego working for a man who was about to leave the University of San Diego as my PhD mentor. Dr. Adam Sapelski, he works on damselflies, and he's now in Arkansas, in Fayetteville, very happy. And I started as his postdoc and worked through the postdoc channel. And then I became a visiting assistant professor after he left. And then I applied for his job, and here I am. So I'd like to tell people it was the best postdoc ever. That's not a normal trajectory. That's a lot of luck. Many people working in academia now have to go through 1, 2, 3 postdocs, moving around the country, around the world, bringing their families. Other faculty in our department really have just been through the ringer in order to end up somewhere with a faculty position, because they're so competitive. So I'm really lucky.
Yeah, I also feel like I was lucky to end up in entomology. Growing up, I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't really think like academic based careers were for me, or mostly like
Same.
I didn't even know about them really. I think my first time I was like, wow, I want to do something with scientisty. I like watched like Jurassic Park, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to work on dinosaurs. And I was probably only like 5 or 6, and then I was like, wow, I don't know if I can do that. Like that's really like out of like my realm and like what my family had been doing. And then like growing up between like 5 and 10, I was like, maybe I want to be like a nail technician, or like for a while I was like, what if like I'm a good waitress? Um, and really, it kind of blows me away when I talk to any of my colleagues who were like, oh, I know what I wanted to do. Like, here's all like the different positions that like I've envisioned myself through the years. And really, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a waitress or working in the service industry, but not having this like initial exposure as a kid to academia. My parents didn't have degrees when I was growing up. My mom, she actually went back to college to get her teaching degree at the same time I started my undergrad.
Oh, I
Um,
didn't know that. Oh, that's
yeah.
great.
So it was really nice to kind of like navigate that with her. But being my mom, like full time, and I have two younger siblings, she had to do like her classes like online at like night. And our experiences were so different, I think. Um, I don't want to say like she wasn't like helpful in preparing me to go to like a 4 year university, but it was a very different experience for both of us. And it's definitely hard, I think, to walk in as somebody who hadn't been exposed to things like this and try to figure it out just on my own. It
Yeah.
was hard.
Yeah, it's a game. And people who play the game and who grew up playing the game don't realize it's a game and there are rules. But it's a game and there are rules. And some people know the rules and some people don't know the rules. So I think for those of us who get there, it's a part of our job to teach people the rules, right?
Yeah, it's been, I think, definitely difficult learning the rules and understanding what's going on kind of behind the scenes in academia. But I think one thing I've also noticed um, is I think like growing up in a community that didn't have a lot of money, my even now, like as an adult, like the language that I use is very different than like my academic peers who grew up, whose parents worked on different college campuses or were professors. And sometimes it's like frustrating because even now I'll be like trying to express an idea and I'm like, oh, I don't want to sound like I don't know what I'm talking about because I know what I'm trying to say, but I don't always have like the academic language to say these things. And that's difficult for
Yep.
me for
I
sure.
totally understand. I do. Yeah. The good thing is that those rules and norms are things you can learn.
Hmm.
The bad thing is that right now, anyway, there's not really a way that we teach them. So you just sort of have to learn them by osmosis. I like to think that's changing as we pay attention to increasing inclusivity in science, that we're recognizing just how much of that we internalize and how much of that we expect our students to just sort of figure out.
This last summer in my lab and kind of over the fall, we've spent a lot of like our weekly lab meetings um, talking about how our lab can be more diverse, more inclusive, um, how we can begin to like include people that we have historically excluded. And part of that, I think one of the things like we've really talked about is field safety. So a lot of the times, like my field work, I call different growers on the phone and I'm like, hey, like I got your number from an extension agent. I'd like to come like look at your plants that you're growing. Can I like come visit you at like your home farm? And sometimes like as a woman, when I have to like drive kind of far, like by myself to go visit these people that I don't know, it can be kind of scary at times. So things that like we've talked about in our lab specifically for field safety is making sure like our MSU vehicles are like identified. So I drive an MSU vehicle over summer and it has like our MSU stickers, making sure you're wearing like your MSU clothing and your MSU attire, um, making sure that like you have everybody's phone numbers, someone knows where you're going, when you're going to be back. We have a log where like we like plan out for the week. Here's where I'm going, that everyone has access to. So that's some of the steps like we've taken just for field safety, and we want that option to be available for all students coming into the lab. So kind of just make it mandatory, so no one feels like, oh, I'm coming in the lab and I have to do this. It's like everybody does it, and not signaling any like single person out.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
but I'm also interested, like, what have you been doing to, you know? increase diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I feel fortunate because I'm an ecologist at a time when there's a growing consciousness about this and a growing acknowledgement. And there's actually a really great growing literature about increasing inclusivity in fieldwork in particular. And so there's some great new papers just from 2020 where they talk about strategies and actually acknowledging what those barriers are for certain demographics, for certain life experiences, actually doing fieldwork. And there are a lot of barriers, as you probably know. And the more axes of diversity you add, the bigger those barriers become. So we have women and women of color and queer women of color, right? The more you stack on, the more challenges there are just in life in general, but also in fieldwork. And so well, to begin, I don't let my students go out by themselves for at least the first couple of years I'm working with them. I think that's really important. Also, just in terms of field safety, I'm really insistent that my students are equipped with a satellite messenger. We work in places without cell service. They need to have a way to contact folks. And then when I do let students go out without me, they're never out alone. And that's not always logistically possible for folks' labs, right? Depending on how many people you have, how much time, how much money, who's working on different projects. But it's generally a good idea, at least like you're saying, to set up a support system. For me, diversity, equity, and inclusion are really important, as important as my science. And I think that it's not distinct from my science. We know that the diversity of scientists increases the quality of your research. There are papers on that too. And I found that to be true in my lab. Diversifying my lab, I do have a diverse lab in comparison with other research programs, other labs at my university. And I think that that has happened in a couple of different ways. And I can't take credit for all of those ways, right? The students they play a super important role in building and maintaining community that's supportive for students of color and students from other underrepresented demographics. And so my recruitment looks different than other people's recruitment. Just because I acknowledge that playing the game is such a big part of it, and that grades are a reflection of one's capacity to play the game just as much as they're a reflection of someone's capacity to be a scientist. And I believe that. I don't recruit the A students from my classes. That's never been a strategy that I use. I recruit students who I think would take advantage of the opportunity to excel. And so that means that my students sometimes work with me and realize they hate it and they go and do something else. Or they work with, right, it means if I'm not attracting like the 4.0 who knows that they're going to go to med school and knows that they need this research experience, right? If I'm looking at a different demographic of students, it means that, they might not all end up as ecologists or doctors, or right. And I really enjoy that dynamic. I enjoy helping students find their place and get their feet underneath them. So on top of just general recruitment, so I recruit a lot from my classes, from extracurricular activities. I'm a mentor for the queer women in science, the queer women group, and then we have an LGBTQ queer in STEM group. So I'm mentors for both of those. I also participate a lot in our Students of Color in STEM organization. And so by that participation, I'm interacting with students and getting to know them, and they'll start to see me as an ally and see that I am putting in the work too. It's not just words, I'm putting in the work as well. Once students are in the lab, we really try and have an elaborate structure for training, right? Like, what do we do? Why do we do it? What is involved? And how does your research fit into that bigger picture? On top of that, my students are fabulous and supportive of each other. And that's really important to me. If you are unable to work in a team, you are not going to be successful in my lab group. We have social events. We have, I mean, you know, Natalie, you were in my lab group.
Yes,
And
I
they're
will.
a rock star group of students who, they're not all going to grow up to be bug people, but they are going to grow up to be awesome people, and they're doing wonderful collaborative things. In fact, this year, my students have formed an anti-racism group for the department. So Isaiah Blanco, Kimia Mostafavi, and Samantha Rodriguez have all sort of banded together to try and challenge some of the impediments that exist in our biology major at the University of San Diego. And so I am super proud that they are challenging power in that way. You do similar advocacy work and you understand it's hard to go against norms. And in science, our norms are pretty strong, we're pretty fixed. And so just helping faculty and students see their privilege and see where racism manifests, that's step one. And so they made a list of demands of the faculty, and the faculty are very slowly working, talking through, acknowledging that there are changes that we can make. So we're, as a department, we have a long way to go, but our students are really taking the charge, and the students in my lab are really taking the charge right now. And I am super proud to be able to be there and help them in that work. It's great.
That's really exciting. I'm
I
gonna have
know.
to get them on the podcast and talk about
Yes, you
what they've
will.
done. Let's
Yes, you
swap
will.
ideas.
Kimia Mostafavi.
Okay, is she okay? I know Kimia, not very well, just a couple times, but Kimia and Sam, from what I've heard, are fantastic people, and I am excited to work with them.
Yeah, the current project that they're encouraging all of the faculty to do is add our anti-racism statements to our department websites. So that students who are considering taking classes, students who are considering a research lab, can see a professor's perspective on diversity and inclusion before committing, so that they can make sure that they're finding the right kind of supportive environment. And I'm really looking forward to us having that information available to our students, just to give them more agency to make an informed choice about who they work with, what they're doing with their time, right?
Yeah, that's really exciting. I hope that also becomes like one of the goals of this podcast is incoming graduate students who are maybe looking for which professors they can be like, oh, they interviewed all the professors in the department. Let's like listen and see what they think. Which
Yep.
is
You will have a great repository of information. Yeah, that's wonderful.
yes, it's
That's a
very
great
exciting.
resource. Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so your lab, yeah, has always been very diverse. I think what's really interesting is you bring in a lot of students with a lot of different backgrounds and interests, and then they work really well as a team. So I'm thinking about our undergraduate paper we published and how diverse our team was. And I think a lot about like Gabby and Lauren. They were our co-authors on the paper, and who were not so much ecology focused, but very mathematically, statistically inclined. And I really think it was so great to have such different interests on that paper. I think it came out really well.
Can I give a little background on your paper?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So one of the avenues of research that my lab is working on, we do this field ecology with the communities of multiple insects, like I mentioned earlier, but we also do more fine-scale behavioral experiments with individual species to see what those individual species are doing in response to drying, in response to changes in climate, in response to this variability in the environment. And so Natalie and her co-authors took charge of a project on a particular species of beetle that responds to drought. And so they were looking at the environmental cues that are actually inducing behavioral changes when drying happens. So there's a drought. We see all the aquatic invertebrates leave or bury, or something happens, and then the water comes back and everybody pops up again. But we don't know what the mechanism is. And so Natalie's project, and now several other students working in my lab, have projects that are looking at what is the cue that makes a beetle think, huh, maybe I should fly away from this pool that's drying? What exactly are they responding to? Conductivity? Is it temperature? Is it water level? I mean, what is the factor? And so those kinds of, we know nothing about this. We know very little about it in terrestrial insects, and we know nothing about it in aquatic insects. And so it's a really exciting avenue of research for students. So because of that, when I have research courses where students are looking for research experiences, they don't know exactly what they want to work on, these kinds of small scale laboratory-based behavioral experiments are just ideal for students because they can find something that they think is kind of cool, run some experiments in the lab, and if something sticks, then they can follow through and turn it into a publication. And that's exactly what Natalie did. So Natalie was studying haliplids, which are the crawling, well, I feel bad talking about your paper. Did you want to talk about your paper?
No, go ahead. It's been quite a while. There's been
It
a
has.
couple papers since then. So.
That's true. That you have been very productive. So she was studying crawling water beetles, which, unlike diving beetles have all these elaborate mechanisms for swimming through the water, and they're highly predaceous and they hunt, and very well adapted for the aquatic environment. And we know a lot more about diticid beetles. Those are the beetle family Diticidae. But Natalie and her colleagues chose to study Haliplidae, which is a much less known family of beetles. And they have many fewer, apparently, from the first take, they have fewer adaptations to survive in a harsh desert aquatic environment. And so what her team was looking at is, what exactly do these beetles do when ponds start to dry? And beyond that, which are the cues? What are the beetles sensing that causes them to respond? And so her team was looking at two particular behavioral responses that these beetles do in response to drought. One was dispersal, so when they fly away, and the second is burial in the sediment. And we've seen both in the field for different aquatic organisms. Water goes away, they got to do something. Are they going to fly? Are they going to bury deep down to the water where there is water underneath the sediment? And so they were able to plan this massive manipulative experiment with incubators and hundreds of beetles, and they were manipulating conductivity, water level, and temperature in a fully factorial experiment in incubators at the University of San Diego. Massive amount of effort. And so they began this experimental design during the term in this research course. And then the interested students, including Natalie and her co-authors, decided to stay on. And anyone who does experimental research knows it never works the first time. So they had to redo the experiments a little more rigorously during the spring term, the following term, in order to get the data that they could write up for publication. And so it was just a great collaboration and a great example of how students can come together and make things happen. The only one who's continued studying bugs is Natalie. Everyone else has gone off, and we have a student in med school, we have someone working in biotechnology right there, which is wonderful. And this was a great experience for all of them. So yeah, that's an example of one of those. Oh, and it was published in the Journal of Insect Behavior, which is a perfect place for these small scale, but really important studies. Yeah, and so I have students who I'm teaching another 490, Natalie, this coming fall. And I think we're going to look at photoperiod, because there's some evidence that, with climate change, photoperiod and the temperature regimes, they're currently synced. Animals, when the days start to be longer, the temperature starts to change. And so organisms who are going through developmental cycles can use either temperature or photoperiod as a cue to fly away, to lay eggs, to pupate, right? Whatever it is, they can use those environmental cues. The problem is now when photoperiod is no longer in sync with temperature like it used to be, because we're having earlier snow melt, warmer winters. Some winters we don't get rainfall at all. And so that means that animals that were using photoperiod as a cue now might be emerging, like it might be too hot by the time the days are longer, right? And so the last time I taught the class, the students were seeing some really interesting signals of photoperiod. and how beetles were responding to photoperiod. So it's another small experiment with a single species. They came up with that idea, and so we're going to pursue it. That's exciting.
That's really exciting. So, for our listeners who don't know, you work only or primarily with undergraduate students. USD does not have really any master's programs.
So we do have master's programs. We do not have master's programs in biology.
Right. I think
So,
we have like marine biology has a master's
right,
program.
there's a marine science master's program, but they're few and far between. We are a primarily undergraduate institution, which was one of the reasons I wanted to work there, because I really value my research with undergraduates and the opportunity to teach. And so that was a real draw. And so I love it that I can have undergraduates with very little experience in science come into my lab and learn what they want to do for a career or learn what they don't want to do for a career. I think it's a great point to get in. I didn't do research as an undergrad. I didn't even know that was a thing, that undergrads could do research with a professor. I didn't learn that until I was in grad school. So I love it that I can introduce students to that, and especially introduce students like Natalie to that, who also didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, I had no clue, but I will say I think my undergraduate research experience was probably one of like the most important things. Well, I've done a lot of like, I don't know, important things, but like career related, it felt so important. And in preparation for grad school, having done one experiment and been through the process of like designing it, implementing it, redesigning it because it didn't work, doing it again, and then kind of going through the whole process of like, okay, well, you have the data. What do we do now? And then even like the writing process, it was so hard, I think. Um, the first time, well, it's been hard these like other times
I
too.
was gonna say it's
It
not
doesn't get
really
easier.
easy anymore.
No, 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 it's not
It
easy.
gets easier. It's just never easy.
But I think like having that experience to have just been through the whole process was so important. And it made me feel like I was ready for grad school in a way that I think if I hadn't done it, it would have been so hard. And I think, after I graduated, I did work in your lab for like this following summer and then like a year after. And I think like having that room to grow, so like starting as like working, under you as like here's my advisor, and then taking on more of like a leadership role in the lab was really, really important to like my development as like a scientist. So then when I first came to MSU in the summer of 2019, so 2 summers ago, and I had this like whole research project, and my PI, who is now my advisor and still my PI, when she was like, "All right, here you go, just go do your science." It was even though the project was it was pretty planned out, but even things like making decisions on like a daily basis and having made those types of decisions before was really important. And apparently she liked me because I'm still in her lab. So
Yeah, you did something right.
yeah, um, it really was like when I came to MSU, I wasn't necessarily looking for like a master's program to join. And then it was really great, I think, being able to work as like a lab tech for a summer and then decide like, wow, like I like the lab, I like what you're doing, I like everybody in the lab, which was really important. Um, and then it's been really helpful this past year with everybody being in quarantine to have already known the lab. I think if I had
Hmm.
walked into this lab without the summer experience and not knowing them, it would have been really hard for me. And the new and the incoming graduate students that came in with me, my cohort, if you are brand new out of another university and you hadn't had
Yeah.
much time at MSU, you guys are amazing. Like that's crazy to me.
Yeah, that's really hard. And again, those barriers of remote education increase for folks with more marginalized identities, right? And so getting people into science who never thought they'd go into science is only harder now, right? And building that community and making sure that we are teaching people the rules and norms, right? All of that is way more challenging now in COVID lands. And so, yeah, I'm really proud of you.
Thanks. I think USD being USD is a private school. There's a lot of money coming into USD for a lot of different things. So there's a lot of resources, I think, when you're doing research on that campus. Um, I felt like we had a lot of opportunities to do things. We have a lot of equipment available to us. And right now, this past semester, I've been getting ready to run experiments for the spring. So, kind of doing like my pre trials, which consisted of I work in onions, so I have to grow my own plants. But I had to like grow them in my apartment to reduce going to campus. And not having some of those like campus resources available to me was so frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
And it really like hit me that there's this, not that I didn't know, but there's this big, I don't know what the right word is, but just that some people don't have the same access to do the same science. It really hit me that like if you don't have these tools and this funding, like that's incredible that you're like it. I don't even have the language for this, but
Well, I think this is another challenge though, because schools like the University of San Diego, it's a private school. It's a private Catholic school, and it is a PWI in addition to a PUI. It is a primarily white institution. And you often see, pretty much always, except for the HBCUs, you see those private schools and that the socioeconomics are tied together, of course.
mm-hmm.
And so I do agree that USD provides awesome opportunities for research for students. But it's even a bigger challenge to provide those opportunities at the larger state schools, right? Because there are funding challenges, and I have financial support from USD to bring students into my lab. I also have external funding that helps bring y'all into my lab too. But at a large state school, they mostly rely on external funding, right? So your PI has to apply for outside money in order to support diversity initiatives in her lab or in order to support incoming students. And so that's an additional burden. Yeah,
Yeah,
for
it's
keeping undergrads in science. Mhm.
yeah. And I think one thing that's really different between like USD and MSU is this like research first versus this undergraduate education focus that we see at USD. And I was definitely blown away by how few undergraduates even like work in labs at MSU.
Mhm.
Um, and I really feel like we're almost doing a disservice to them sometimes. Um, like,
Mhm.
yes, it's hard to find funding, and we do need to pay our undergraduates if we can. We can't just
Mhm.
always be like, oh, come in our lab and
Mhm.
work for free. At USD, you do get your credits for that. But if we want to bring in like diverse students, it is a challenge to find money to bring them in, to pay them for their labor, um, to pay for like moving costs. It's a lot.
Mhm.
It's hard for sure.
Yep, those barriers are pretty tall. Mhm.
Yeah, but we are working our way through them.
We're
Um,
pushing. That's all we can do.
yes. But we are getting close to our allotted time. Do you have any last minute questions for me?
Well, I think we ended on kind of a downer note.
Yeah, we did for sure.
I would like to focus on people like you, Natalie, as a success story, right? As
Thanks.
someone, well, I mean, it's great, right? And it takes a lot of bravery for you to leave your folks here in Southern California and move across the country. And I mean, you found this position that would pay you to do science and would be supportive of your career goals and help you learn the rules and the norms, right? And so these programs exist. We know they exist. These people exist because we see Natalie here being successful. And so it's really inspiring. And I hope that other people can see you as a role model. I mean, it's going to be hard and it's not done, but I think they can see you as a role model of just what it takes to get there, and also what characteristics you can use to be successful. Because there's a lot of imposter syndrome that students have to overcome in order to be successful. And students of color, queer students, students from lower socioeconomic groups, students of color have even more obstacles. And so I'm really proud of you and the work that you're doing to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in science, and to be a rock star scientist yourself.
Thanks.
So,
okay, before we sign off, actually, you reminded me, did you want to hear a funny story about when I accepted my lab tech position at MSU?
Yes, please. Tell me a funny story.
Well, I don't know if it's like that funny, but I didn't even tell my parents that I was applying for out-of-state jobs, or that
I was wondering if you did that.
No, I didn't tell them at all. I just I didn't tell them I had like interviews or anything. It was like after I had like accepted the position, we were having dinner, and my brother, he's about 5 years younger than me, so he was like just telling my parents like, I don't know if like college is like right for me, which is okay too. It's not, it's okay.
For sure.
And my parents were like so upset at dinner. I was like, all right, we're gonna get this out of the way. I was like, Mom, Dad, I'm moving to Michigan. And they were like, what are you talking about? They thought I was joking. They're like, what do you mean? What do you mean you're moving to Michigan? I was like, yeah, we have like 6 weeks and then I'm moving to Michigan. And they're like, what are you
Natalie,
talking about? And I just told them like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I in fact have a student who is having similar struggles with her family. I might connect you with her, Natalie, so you can maybe give her a little mentorship. Although I don't really encourage her to go through that route of telling her family that she's moving across the country.
Yeah, I just was like, well, my brother said he's not going to college. This was, their dream for him. And now I'm going to move away. And they ended up being like really supportive. My dad actually like drove me across the country so I could have my car and stuff. But they were shocked. Oh my gosh, they were shocked. They're not happy for a little bit, but
I mean, not everybody can be that brave.
yeah,
right?
I think they're like, what are you talking about? They're like, where did this come from? They're like, no warning, just out of the blue. So I don't know. Don't do that, you guys. Just like give them like a heads up, like, hey, like I'm applying for out-of-state jobs. I don't know, but it worked out for me and I'm here, so sorry, Mom and Dad.
But good job, Mom and Dad, because she's turning out great.
Thanks. All right, everybody, thanks for listening in. Kate, thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you for the invitation. This has been fun.
Yes, of course. And we will listen to you. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah, I encourage your listeners to reach out if they have any questions.
Oh, yes, for sure. Is it okay if we link your Twitter to our episode caption and everyone can check
I'm more
you out?
active. I'm more active on Instagram than on Twitter.
Okay, great. We will link both.
Great. Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, listeners.